Hello Year 12. In today's lesson we're going to continue to study Punishment by Seamus Heaney. We're going to begin our lesson with our daily review like we normally do, then I'm going to introduce the big question, introduce a new piece of subject vocabulary, and then we're going to read and annotate the poem before I set the preparation tasks ready for next lesson. Okay, so your daily review questions are on the board. If you could pause the video here and work your way through the questions. Okay, so question 1, what caused conflict in Northern Ireland? So it was a political rather than a religious conflict, but there was one group that wanted independence from the United Kingdom and another group that wanted to remain as part of the United Kingdom, and that caused conflict. What were the aims of the IRA? The aims of the IRA were they wanted Northern Ireland to be independent. What is significant about Chopin's choice of setting for The Awakening? So The Awakening is set in Louisiana, which was a Catholic state, which meant that divorce would have been completely unheard of almost. And it was also quite old-fashioned in terms of the values that were held. Question 4, recall a moment from The Awakening where Edna shows a disregard for social norms. Now this happens all the time in the text, but one that stands out is when she refuses to meet with Leonce's friends and clients on a Tuesday. She gets rid of her Tuesday meetings. When she disobeys him, when she moves into the pigeon house on her own. Lots of different times that you might have put for question 4 there. Okay, today's big question then that I want you to be able to answer by the end of the lesson is, what does Heaney suggest about the strict rules and expectations of society when it comes to love? So you can probably already guess that there's going to be a link between our poem and The Awakening, and that link comes from society's expectations. Okay, so just a reminder, this poem was published in 1975 and it's Punishment that we're looking at today, which can be found on page 31 of your anthologies. So the subject vocabulary that I want us to be using in today's lesson is this word, volta. It's a noun, and in poetry, the volta or turn is a rhetorical shift or dramatic change in thought and or emotion. So as I read the poem to you today, I want you to be looking for the moment of change, because there is a very stark shift in this poem, and that is called the volta. So if you spot it as I read to you today, I want you just to make a note of where you think you found it. I'm going to read the poem to you. I haven't put the poem on the screen yet. You can follow in your anthologies. Before we read, I just want to show you that there is a glossary of terms on the screen, so it might be an idea to look at those now before I read and to note any words that you're unsure of down in your anthology. So to locate these words in the poem and to note down their definition in your anthology. Off you go. Okay, so here is the poem. I can feel the tug of the halter at the nape of her neck, the wind on her naked front. It blows her nipples to amber beads. It shakes the frail rigging of her ribs. I can see her drowned body in the bog, the weighing stone, the floating rods and boughs, under which at first she was barked sapling that is dug up, oak bone, brain firkin. Her shaved head like a stubble of black corn, her blindfold a soiled bandage, her noose a ring, to store the memories of love. Little adulteress, before they punished you, you were flaxen-haired, undernourished, and your tar-black face was beautiful. My poor scapegoat, I almost love you, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. I am the artful voyeur of your brain's exposed and darkened combs, your muscles, webbing, and all your numbered bones. I who have stood dumb when your betraying sisters, called in tar, wept by the railings. Who would connive in civilized outrage, yet understand the exact and tribal intimate revenge. So the story of the poem. Seamus Heaney describes his thoughts upon seeing one of the bog bodies. Initially, he's horrified, he's absolutely disgusted at the brutal tribal punishments that this woman was subject to, and he describes them in great detail as well to show how shocked he is at her treatment. But we can look at moments of history and things that happen in the past and think that they happened so long ago and that times have changed and moved on. But then he has a moment of reflection and he thinks about the things that he's seen amongst the conflict that he's seen around him, and he starts to liken the punishment of the bog body, as it's called, to the punishments that people around him are experiencing in his own time at the hands of the IRA. And he starts to really consider his place in all of that and how he reacts and what he's actually done. So Heaney's scornful of society's treatment of people who deviate from social norms in pursuit of love. And he seems to suggest that this wasn't just something that happened in the past, that we're not suddenly more liberal now, or at the time that he was writing, in terms of our treatment of people who deviate away from social norms when it comes to love. And he talks about how awful and brutal the punishments are for people who deviate away from social norms. Read through the poem again on your own and see if you can spot the volta, the moment of change in this poem. Okay, so for me, the moment of change, the part that I've identified as the volta, is this part here on your screen. I almost love you, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. I am the artful voyeur. And for me, this is the volta in the poem because it's the point at which he shifts from talking about the past and shifts to talk about the present, the moment that he sees around him. It's also indicated because you have the change from, I know he uses the pronoun I at the start and places himself within the poem, but it's the moment at which he stops talking about the bog body and begins to place himself within the poem, so we can note the change because of his change to the pronoun I. This particularly is a really interesting part of the poem for me as well, and I want to focus on it in isolation before we go back and look at the rest of the poem. So, Heaney places himself within the poem here, and he reflects on his own position in society, in a society where he's seen people be punished for deviating away from the social norms of the time. And it's important to note that he doesn't support the punishment of these people, that he too sees that it's brutal, tribal and it's wrong, but he does carry around a lot of guilt. And that comes, and the guilt story is really shown through the lines, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. So he feels a lot of guilt because he has been silent and he hasn't stood up and spoken out against, or he feels he hasn't spoken out enough against these brutal punishments that he sees in his own time. He calls himself the artful voyeur. You might have noted from my glossary that a voyeur is someone who just watches. So whilst he doesn't take part in any punishments himself, he doesn't deliver any punishments himself, he feels guilty because he just stands back and watches and doesn't say anything. Talking about casting the stones as well, that's a reference to an ancient punishment where people would have been stoned, they would have had stones thrown at them in order to punish them for wrongdoing. So he uses that as a metaphor for his inaction. Okay, in terms of looking at the poem as a whole then, I've split the poem into two parts. The part where he's talking about the past and the brutal punishment of the bog body at the time of her being alive. And then the second part of the poem that we'll look at on the next slide talks about his own experience and punishments that he's seen in his own time. So Initially, I want to draw your attention to the opening line. I think it's a really important one because he says, I can feel the tug of the halter at the nape of her neck. So the halter would be the rope that was placed around her neck. And he says that he can almost feel that in looking at it. So the body has been so well preserved that he can really see the punishments that she was subjected to. But it also shows his complete empathy towards this character, if you like, this person. So the opening line is important because it reveals the writer's empathy, the fact that he can feel that tug around her neck. Also important in this part is the almost list, but not quite list, the references to the various different punishments that this character would have been subject to. So the nudity, so her naked front and the reference to her nipples, combined with the shaving of the head, you find that her shaved head like a stubble of black corn. So these are referenced as punishments brought about to bring shame on the recipient. So they're visual markings of her shameful behaviour, if you like, the punishment that she was given for what society deemed was her shameful behaviour. There's also a lot of reference, I'll change colour pen now, to the violence that this person received. So you've got the floating rods and bowels, which would have been used to whip the person, the weighing stone, which would have been attached to this person so that they did drown in the bog, the noose as well, again the rope around her neck. So we can see that this person's been subject to some real brutal and tribal punishment. So far in terms of my annotations, I'd want to make reference to the writer's sense of empathy. Right at the start, I would be writing empathy next to that opening line. And then I would be writing about the brutal tribal punishment that this person received. Okay. The next thing I'd like to draw your attention to is Heaney's use of the symbolism of the ring. So we know that the ring is a universal symbol of eternity. It's used in a marriage to show the eternal bond between two people, and that's no different in this poem. So here the noose is a ring in which the person stores memories of love. So we have a slight change here where he's really humanised the body, and he's reflecting and giving a story, a narrative to the body that he's seen, and he talks about he infers, that the person has been punished for love that doesn't conform to society's norms. We know this because he refers to her as a little adulteress, which means a female that has had a sexual relationship outside of what society would have permitted at the time. And it's almost, in this part, he shows us that she died for love. And the symbol of the ring there, to store the memories of love, almost suggests that it was worth the risk for this person. The love was so strong that they risked experiencing all of this in order for those memories of love. So next to where you've circled ring and underlined adulteress, I would write something down about how the ring shows the eternal connection between the two and the fact that she was actually willing to die for her love. And again, he adds a narrative. He imagines what she might have looked like before. For me, this section here suggests the wasted life of the woman, how it was unnecessary that she died. And he uses this noun, scapegoat. Again, this is one I defined in my glossary. A scapegoat is a person that is blamed for the actions of others. Often if a big group has done wrong and they blame it on one person, that person would become the scapegoat, the one who takes the punishment for the rest of them. So here that's really interesting because it seems to be a scorn on how society has treated women in the past. So the man wouldn't have been as harshly blamed for adultery, but for the woman, adultery was a crime that was punishable by death in this society, and therefore she's called a scapegoat because they both loved each other, the man and the woman, we can infer. However, the woman is the one that was punished and killed for the love, and that's why Heaney calls her a scapegoat. It's quite interesting from a feminist perspective, this, because it shows the treatment of women in society and how often they're blamed. Okay, moving on to the second part of the poem then. Hopefully all of you will have marked this stanza with our subject terminology, which was Volta. This is the point of change. I almost love you, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. So next to this, if you haven't already, from when we talked through this earlier on in the lesson, I'd like you to first label it as the Volta, and then I'd like you to write about Heaney's feelings of guilt. Guilt for not speaking up about the punishments that he sees in his own society. Guilt for not standing up for those who deviate away from social norms in the name of love. And for his position as a voyeur, as someone who stands back and watches. And he shows his feelings of guilt through the line, but would have cast, I know, the stones of silence. So casting stones, throwing stones at a person, was a punishment that would have been used, and his punishment that he's committed, he has given to these people, is that he hasn't stuck up for them. He's stood back and stayed silent, and he feels a great deal of guilt for that. And at this point he talks about the present tense. He changes from looking at the past and these punishments that we might have thought had only happened because it was so far back in the past that society looked completely different, and he relates that to his own society. Here when he says, I who would have stood dumb, which means he wouldn't have said a single thing, he would have stood dumb without speaking, when your betraying sisters called in tar wept by the railings. So last lesson, when we looked at contextual knowledge, we learnt about how the IRA had been known to cover someone in tar and throw feathers on them, usually people who were UK sympathisers, but also women who had acted in a way that they deemed deviated from the social norms. So an adulteress, for example, might be called in tar and had feathers thrown over them. So this is a really brutal punishment that we wouldn't expect to happen in 1975, at the time in which the poem was being written. We'd expect that to be a really ancient thing, but no, it's still happening today, is what Heaney suggests. So he shows his disgust at the punishments that happen in the past, but then he relates it to the things that happen in his own society, and suggests that perhaps society's attitudes towards love haven't changed that much, that society still punishes people for deviating away from social norms. And he uses the noun sisters here, your betraying sisters. We can see that the adjective betraying is probably used because those women have also committed adultery. And he uses sisters to unite the two women, the two groups of women, the women from the past that were punished in the way that he describes at the beginning of the poem, and the women today. And he shows that society hasn't moved on in terms of its attitude towards people who deviate away from social norms. Okay, now see if you can answer the big question. What does Heaney suggest about the strict rules and expectations of society when it comes to love? Pause the video here and have a go at answering that question. And then finally, your preparation tasks for next lesson. I would like you to answer this question, and I'd like you to email me or to note down on Show My Homework your response to the question. How does this poem compare to The Awakening in terms of love and society? So in terms of attitudes towards love and social norms, how does this poem compare to The Awakening? Okay, thank you very much.